safety. Chapter 481 Mixed Heritage by Hydesgrain. All of Jason's negative emotions, whether it was wrath, anger, or agony, had been released into the crescent sword beam that was empowered by a tremendous amount of mana. He had to gasp for air, and his sight blurred as a single tear poured down his cheeks. The emotions that had devoured his entire being were released through his father's divine silver aura, and his infernal Celestia aura began to revert to the Celestia aura he had before. Nevertheless, the outlines of Jason's pupils were still crimson. Yet, his entire focus was on the crescent sword blade he had shot at the Drake Alliance's army. Several tens of thousand beings had been killed in an instant, ripped apart, and nobody, whether they were at the Lick or Prisma stage, was strong enough to survive the attack. Evading was the only option, however, that was only possible if the trembling legs allowed them to move. Yet, instead of being able to move, they could only look at the massive crescent sword blade that shot towards them. At that moment, the armor and wings around Jason dispersed into tens of thousands of tiny flames that descended to the ground, entering the body of those that had been killed. It looked ominous, but Jason knew that it was Solaris' way to absorb mana, the remaining life force that was about to evaporate, and more importantly, the Creato flames stemming from the Ephritas the crescent sword beam had killed. However, at the same time, Jason, who was unable to stay firmly on the ground after what had happened, could barely see anything in front of him. Everyone looked at Jason in shock, and it was only a moment later that his body began to tremble and it was on the brink of collapsing. He could barely stay conscious as he sensed a light gust of wind behind him, only to hear Lucian's familiar, yet trembling and frightened voice. Were you able to prevent turning into an infernal Celestia? Lucian seemed to be afraid of Jason, even more so after what he had seen, but Jason only nodded his head. My father helped me. I need to take a short break, otherwise, I don't know what will happen. Lucian assumed that the silver, divine aura was what had allowed Jason to prevent turning into an infernal Celestia, yet, he didn't know how it was possible for the divine aura to manifest out of nowhere. If Celestia Yaldra was able to transfer some of his aura to Jason, shouldn't it be possible to do more than simply acting in the worst case, or is there more behind it? Nevertheless, Lucian was still dumbfounded about the fact that Jason had been able to summon a replica of the Gates of Hell. However, even more astonishing that the massive crescent sword beam Jason had manifested had killed more than 200,000 opponents, ranging from the low Lick stage to the lowest Prisma stage. It was obvious that Jason didn't aim at a certain area of the battlefield which would have killed many more opponents, but it was as if he had been unable to move a single inch after his weapon had been brandished. As such, Lucian took away Jason while shouting towards his subordinates. We have an advantage now. Attack. Don't show any mercy. There was not a single living being unaffected by the miraculous event that happened, and it was only when Lucian had ordered his own people to attack that the halted battle continued. Compared to a few minutes earlier, the Drake Alliance's morale had plummeted drastically. The cause was none other than the replicas of the Gates of Hell that had appeared and the silver divine aura that had prevented the Gates of Hell from fully emerging. However, nobody had been aware that mankind, if not the whole planet, would have more problems than a few races fighting about the reigns of Argos and the inhabiting humans. The Gates of Hell had their name not without reason, and once opened, hell would descend. Replicas were weaker and had many restrictions in comparison to the originals, but that didn't mean it was less dangerous to Argos, which was in fact a planet in its infant stage. Meanwhile, Jason felt as if millions of thoughts, ideas, and questions emerged in his mind, only to figure out that he was as clueless as before. Maybe it was even worse than that. Despite being extremely exhausted, Jason suppressed the desire to fall asleep because he knew that he would enter a comatose state in which he would sleep for several days. He was still responsible for helping the others in defeating the Ephrita race. Little did he know that his massive crescent blade had annihilated almost half of the Ephrita race's army at once. Jason was aware that he would have never been able to summon the replica of the Gates of Hell nor such a powerful crescent sword beam. That was at least under normal circumstances, and he began to recall what exactly had happened on the battlefield. My mind went blank for a second before I unleashed Solaris' entire combat prowess. My aura and stigma, did that unleash my wrath and anger, or was it something else? Since his mother had died, he was bullied because of his blindness, and there had never been a time he was strong enough to defend himself. It was only when he gained his eyesight that this was possible. However, from what he could tell, everything around him had begun to worsen since that day. Not only were there multiple incidents, and in the end, a war of more than a dozen races broke out on Argos. The emotions of humans were easier to manipulate, and Jason recalled his father's words that he shouldn't let them manipulate him. Instead, he should take control of his emotions. With that, he might even be able to control even the gates of hell. Even though Jason had heard what his father had said, he was unable to grasp the complete meaning of every word. Were his words literally meant, or was there something hidden within the long speech he held? Jason didn't know, but what he could tell was the fact that the Celestia race's emotions should be more difficult to manipulate, otherwise, his father wouldn't have said something about the part of Jason that has human blood. Advantages and disadvantages, he mumbled inwardly as Lucen left him after being sure that Jason was fine. The Elver had brought him to the camp that had been constructed for the injured soldiers or those that required rest from fighting too long. Yet, Jason and the high number of medics that had soul bonds with healing abilities were the only ones inside the camp right now. Nobody dared to approach Jason after what they had sensed, and from the view of it, his physical state seemed to be fine. As an infernal Celestia, I would be unable to control my emotions, they would be corrupted and manipulated me. I would be hunted by every living being, but that shouldn't mean I'm not allowed to be angry, sad, or infuriated by something. I suppose. Earlier, this was fine too. Jason knew that the problems with controlling his emotions had only started occurring after Scorpio had died. This had become worse over time and reached its peak when his masters had died. But, to think that his emotions were about to devour and corrupt him, turning him into a bloodthirsting being, was something Jason couldn't grasp. How can I even control my emotions instead of allowing them to control me? What exactly does that even mean? If something bad happens, I'm sad, and the same applies for happiness, anger, and so on. There is nothing I can do about that. However, just like that, Jason also recalled his father saying something about releasing his anger, wrath, and sorrow instead of allowing it to accumulate. Is the Celestia race a more emotional race than I thought? If they expose their emotions all the time, instead of concealing them, they should be deemed as honest, blunt and straightforward, right? Jason was mumbling to himself, and it was not like he was trying to find a direct solution to his problem. He was already glad that he didn't feel much of all negative emotions he had released at once thanks to his father's silver divine hue. Unbeknownst to himself, Jason had accepted his father to a certain extent because he had helped him. At the same time, he could tell that Celestia Yaldra had been worried about him, which was another reason for Jason to think that his father might have been better than he had been in his childhood memories. Can I release my emotions as I did before, in an attack, without anyone's help, or is that something I need a great amount of mana and someone's guidance? In the end, everything that occurred resulted in his terrific high mana absorption that had suddenly been revealed when the entire battlefield turned into an area void of mana. Jason was still not sure what his future would look like, but he could tell that his mixed heritage as a human and Celestia would be interesting, and even more dangerous than he thought. How could Jason that his heritage was grander but even more dangerous and devastating than anyone could have ever expected? Chapter 482 Contribution by Hydesgrain. Time flew by, and it was only when the number of heavily injured people that were sent back to the camp increased that Jason thought it was time for him to enter the battlefield once again. Solaris had already informed him that it had absorbed the life force, mana, and creato flames of those the massive crescent blade beam had killed. As such, Jason wouldn't have any problems supplying Petri with life force to accelerate his evolution, while Solaris could annex more soul energy as it had nurtured its mana core and everything revolving around it. There was also enough mana to utilize Kumo and Diga for a long duration, which allowed Jason to allow Artemis to occupy his mana core instead of Solaris. For the time being, he wanted to prevent attracting too much unwanted attention. Solaris' full body armor and black wings were such a mean, and it was better to be more careful than he had been before. The Drake Alliance should be wary of him right now. Thus, Jason decided to utilize Artemis wings and Kumo as the only means to fight for now. Other than that, he decided to use Artemis Ice Affinity while Solaris Black Flame would only be manifested at the tip of Kumo's barrel. If there were opponents too strong for Jason to handle, he would either retreat or simply unholster Diga, with which he was confident to kill someone with more than 1,000 drops of liquefied mana. Nevertheless, Jason's reluctance to enter the battlefield in fright that he might cause another incident, or turn into an infernal Celestia, was apparent. Yet, even if that was the case, Jason knew that everyone was using their utmost efforts to protect Argos from being conquered by the Drake Alliance to remain free and unrestrained. Nobody knew what exactly would happen afterward, but it was evident that the Drake Alliance was not good for Argos, let alone mankind. Jason was aware of this, however. He thought that even some big clans and ancient sects had issues with treating their citizens well. Choosing a bad outcome was better than the worst possible because it was still better, and Jason was confident that he could fulfill his master's wish much easier if the Argos Alliance were to be victorious. Taking a deep breath, Jason decided to suppress his aura and stigma as he circulated a large amount of mana through body and Artemis wings before he flew off. Not even 3 minutes had passed before he had entered the battlefield that was littered with blood, spilled organs, and dead bodies. This sight was among the worst one could see during any war, but Jason, who was inserting a large amount of mana into his eyes to look out for Solaris remnants, simply ignored them. It was difficult, but his mind seemed to be filtering out everything negative since he had fired the crescent sword blade. While searching the nurtured flames of Solaris, Jason had unholstered Kumo, which he used to shoot several humans from other big clans, without mercy. His heart was cold, and to Jason, it felt like he had no emotions left in his body, whether they were good or bad. This was something uncommon for him because he had always revealed his happiness and positivity. Only his anger, wrath, and agony had been suppressed most of the time, but now, his entire being felt uncomfortable and weird, as if he was nothing but an empty shell. There was only his current task at hand, and once he found the first remnant of Solaris flames that were covered within the drained body of the deceased it had absorbed, Jason summoned it. Solaris was originally not even a large flame and had only the size of his palm within its normal state. However, this could change in a single moment, and one could say that it was disguising itself. A few moments after Solaris had been summoned, it began to create a faint suctioning force that attracted and absorbed every flame in the radius of a few dozen meters. It was also possible to increase this radius, but this would attract too much unwanted attention. Instead, Jason was crossing the battlefield to reach Solaris Flame's remnants, which replenished his used-up mana, the moment he used it up to kill dozens of opponents on his way. Kumo trigger was pulled at a rapid pace, and every time an opponent was killed, Solaris absorbed the remaining life force and mana. Its abilities were truly frightening, and Jason didn't wish to ever encounter someone with a similar affinity as he had. As such, he could only be grateful to have Solaris by his side. It was feeding Petri with life force while absorbing Jason's soul energy the moment its nurtured state allowed this without burning a single soul energy unit. Owing to this, Solaris had already annexed around 830,000 soul energy units, while Artemis had merely annexed 10,000 units, and Petri was only around 3,000 soul energy units. In the end, Artemis would become Jason's weakest soulbond if Petri's evolution was successful, and this bothered him. She had already felt useless for a long time, but now that Solaris was becoming even stronger, while the newest member of their family was about to finish evolving, this intensified. With that being said, Artemis demanded to leave the soul world, which Jason prevented by sealing his soul world. As such, she was complaining the whole time Jason was fighting with his life on the line, until he had to agree to give her as many mana stones and mana cores as she wanted after the Great Argos War would end. This was not disadvantageous towards him at all, and Jason could hardly complain, even more so after Artemis had quieted down. Time passed slowly, and Jason's contribution in the Great Argos War increased, the higher his proficiency and accuracy with Kumo became. Before, replacing an empty magazine took almost 2 seconds, but now the last bullet barely left the barrel before he had already started to replace the empty magazine. Nevertheless, the more opponents he killed, the more attention he attracted. This was the downside he had to face, and stronger foes had begun to attack him. Yet, at the same time, a small group from the Argos Alliance with a mana core at the Prisma stage had noticed Jason's high contribution and efficiency, which caused them to protect him subconsciously. They were aware of what the young man had done earlier. Thus, even if it was not possible to recreate such a miracle, Jason's weapons were extremely fast and most opponents were not strong enough to protect themselves from the mana-burning ability of the black bullets seemed to have. Thus, with time passing slowly, the surrounding area of Jason became less frequent with opponents at the lick stage. I'll go alone. Thanks for protecting me, but you guys attract too much attention. Even more than the gun does. Stay alive. With that being said, Jason used the weightless steps technique at the perfect mastery before he released dense mist from his body. It expanded at a rapid pace, and without anyone knowing, Jason utilized the disguise ability Solaris had learned from Devoured the Silver Origin Flame to alter his facial features. His eye color was still the same as well as his body, however, to disguise himself he took out a robe that covered his body and the simplest tool to disguise himself in order to make his appearance less suspicious. What others looked at to distinguish Jason from others were not his eyes, because other big clans had members with similar eyes due to specific traits, but his stigma. By taking out the miraculous tool he had procured earlier, this could have been hidden to, and it was called camouflage makeup. Chapter 483 Back to Old Times by Hydesgrain. The camouflage makeup he applied on his stigma was nothing special, yet it worked wonders. In a matter of seconds, his golden silverfish-colored stigma had vanished, covered by makeup. Jason never thought that he would have to make use of makeup, but considering that he had just altered his facial features, it might be better for his current situation. The moment he emerged outside the mist that enveloped several dozen opponents and allies, Jason had already picked up a set of daggers that laid next to an Ephrita's carcass. He was ready to fight, and except his eyes, nothing resembled his old self. Jason's facial features had changed, his stigma was covered and he had fully retracted both his aura and the stigma's glow, while his physique was hidden underneath the robe he had put on. With Artemis occupying his mana core, Jason's combat prowess increased drastically, even if he were to utilize nothing but his brute force. Yet, instead of overestimating himself, he decided to make use of his mana eyes and the fact that he could release dense mist explosively. Being able to see, while others weren't, was a huge advantage, yet, at the same time, it could obstruct his own allies. As such, Jason had to be careful about how he attacked others. Thus, instead of releasing dense mist, he made use of his high dagger proficiency, and his martial art techniques to emerge in front of his first opponent at the low lick stage. First, Jason pierced the dagger in his left hand towards his opponent's thigh before he averted its trajectory to pull the dagger upwards. In a smooth motion, his opponent's entire tight up to his chest had been sliced open, revealing an ugly sight. The sight might have been ugly, but Jason couldn't help but think that the Ephrita's daggers were extremely sharp and at least on par with Tier 3 weapons, if not common mana weapons. Thus, he injected more mana into the daggers and the runes inscribed on them began to glow faintly, releasing a faint membrane around them. At this sight, Jason smiled, but instead of wasting any more time, he took a deep breath before he exerted the weightless steps technique at the perfect mastery. In addition to the single sequence of the floating sky technique, he had copied from Serinjiwaya a long time ago. He had yet to meet his old friend, and Jason was eager to do so now that the anger and wrath within him were not devouring him anymore. With that thought in his mind, he became a little bit excited to witness the end of the Great Argos War. The future was a white piece of paper, not predestined and unknown. Everything could be changed or end differently than one thought. Some may say that this was not true and that everything was fated to happen. However, Jason was not one of them. In Jason's opinion, his mother's, Scorpio's, and his master's fate could have been different, if certain things had only changed, but it had already happened, and the past was something that couldn't be changed. While the future was blank, the past had already occurred and been written down. As such, instead of lingering about the past for too long, Jason felt that he was finally able to release the tension he had accumulated for months. The emotions that had corrupted him were released, even if it might only be a temporary solution. Nevertheless, the tension within Jason was something completely different. This was another reason for him to disguise himself, and pick up the daggers from one of the Afritas. Daggers were the weapons he had learned first, and Jason felt like he was walking back in time. His life had been peaceful, and despite being weaker than anyone else, he couldn't help but think that it was much better than fighting with his life on the line. With every second passing, dozens were killed on the battlefield, and Jason contributed to this number. Owing to the sequence of the floating sky movement technique he had learned, his limit of the weightless step technique at the perfect mastery increased, which allowed his speed to accelerate further. Jason's robe fluttered in the wind, while his daggers had been thrust out and retracted every now and then. From slashing, stabbing, to piercing out, Jason's pace never decelerated and he was rushing through the rows of his opponents as if they were not noteworthy. Since the last battle of the Great Argos War had started and after Jason's crescent blade beam had killed 200,000 members of the Drake Alliance, a total of 3 large battlefields had been established. Because it was too dangerous to allow someone at the Prisma stage to remain nearby those at the Lick stage, one battlefield was consistent of all those at the Prisma stage. On the other hand, there were 2 battlefields with individuals at the Lick stage. One for those at the late and peak Lick stage and another one for everyone at the low and mid Lick stage. A single being at the Prisma stage could annihilate everyone at the Lick stage battlefield, and both the Drake and Argos Alliance didn't want that such an accident occurred on their sides. It would be devastating if that happened after all. In the end, attacking someone at a lower stage was considered a universal and unwritten rule during war, accepted by every race. The reason for this was simple: breaking this rule would cause chaos because both sides would start to attack each other's weak forces with their more powerful individuals. Only when war came to end, the losing side would start ignoring this unofficial rule in their last attempt to turn the tides of war and take down as many foes as possible. Both the Arior and Elva race had explained everyone the unofficial rules of war, and nobody would dare to create chaos by breaking them as it would cause too many needless casualties on both sides. With that being said, Jason, who was wreaking havoc in the low and mid-Lick stage battlefield, was able to do almost everything he wanted. Once an opponent was too strong, he would use his curses to gain enough time to react by taking out Diga to shoot armor-piercing bullets at them. Someone at the peak of the mid-Lick stage had around 3,000 drops of mana, thus, Jason's life was only threatened by them. Nevertheless, mankind's strength was not enough to face the sheer mass of opponents at the Lick stage that seemed to be a few times higher compared to the Argos Alliance. As such, both battlefields at the Lick stages were dominated by the Drake Alliance that mainly consisted of foreign races. Despite their weak combat experiences, mankind's weaker physique that had yet to be refined properly, and the fact that the density and purity of mana on Khanir prevented humans to reach a high mana core rank at a young age, made up for this disadvantage. All in all, only mankind's talents and real prodigies were able to make a real difference because their soul bonds and fortified soul conjunctions allowed them to fight multiple common soldiers from the foreign races at once. Jason was not sure how the situation on the Prisma stage battlefield looked like, but he believed that the Elva and Arior race were doing their best to make up for the numerical disadvantage. The Elva race embassy had a higher mana core rank after all. Chapter 484 Safety by Hydesgrain. It was already the second day of the huge battle to determine Argos' supremacy, and the fights were still ongoing. Contrary to everyone's expectations, there had yet to be someone who was able to dominate the other on all three battlefields. Even Jason hadn't expected this, as he was resting for half an hour, replenishing his mana, while altering his facial features once again. At the same time, he picked up a different weapon, only to see that a huge wave of doom crawls was rushing towards their camp that accommodated heavily injured soldiers. Thus, Jason unholstered Kumo and Digo as he stood up to continue his killing spree. His mind was clear since he had released his negative emotions, but Jason knew that this was mainly due to the last traces of the silver, divine aura that lingered within him. This aura that originated from his father had already become weaker through time, while it had already been weak from having been forcefully transferred to Jason, which shouldn't have been an easy task to accomplish for his father. Owing to the divine aura, Jason was able to grasp the Celestia race's combat prowess for the first time. Despite it being weakened, the divine, silver aura was definitely not something that should exist on Argos. It was much mightier than he could have imagined, and it brought up even more confusion and questions than Jason could solve. The wave of doom crawls was large in number, yet, Jason's high accuracy and guns that worked in perfect unison with Solaris made up for the numerical disadvantage. In the end, he couldn't defeat the entire wave alone, but his contribution had been enough so that many people had begun to praise him highly. Since the Great Argos War had begun, the human race had received most casualties, and this did not only include the current battle. However, even worse than the casualties the Argos Alliance had to face was that the three battlefields were being pulled apart. This was not necessarily bad, in the first place, but the place all the three battlefields were approached was definitely not the place the Argos Alliance wanted to fight. Each of the battlefields was slowly being drawn to the different capitals of the three kingdoms on which borders the last battle of the Great Argos had started. Even if Jason wanted to, he couldn't prevent this from happening. Rather, he had decided to report what he perceived to the big clan's powerhouses that were currently resting. Yet, instead of planning to send a scout towards the capitals in order to warn them, nobody seemed to care. Or to be precise, nobody had the energy to do anything. Their pressure was already high as it was, and it was difficult to even survive the torments of elemental attacks that had been unleashed. The mana within the area the three battlefields were situated was unstable and more difficult to control than normally. Furthermore, elemental attacks that flew straight and those who fought in the outer area of their battlefield were likely to encounter scouts that would have been sent out. This was not a problem with the Lick stage battlefields, but it would turn into a problem once one had to fly past the battlefield with all beings at the Prisma stage. Until the battlefields reach the capitals, more than 2 days should pass, if not more. Jason didn't think much of himself, but he recalled Shane's words and that he should protect the weak because they were unable to protect themselves. As such, he could only try his best. He walked away from the middle-aged man he had been talking to as Artemis wings sprouted out of his back. If the others don't want to save the weak, I should at least give my best to prevent the worst from occurring, right? Jason didn't want to see that the three capitals that had accepted millions of refugees from the surrounding, smaller cities, were to be destroyed. His assumption that the battlefields were slowly drifting towards the three capitals might as well be wrong because the current location was still far away, but that was not what mattered. 2 days was what Jason assumed to be the shortest possible time at which the Prisma stage battlefield could reach the closest capital it seemed to be heading to. Inwardly Jason was just shouting, "Fuck it." But on the outside, his expression was emotionless as he circulated some of his replenished mana through Artemis wings. To think that I will have to fly through the Prisma stage battlefield while being at the low Lick stage. This thought was ridiculous and Jason knew how dangerous it was. However, he hoped that concealing his mana core was enough to pass the Prisma stage battlefield without anyone noticing. With that being said, an hour passed in which Jason tried to reach the highest possible altitude so that nobody would notice him, and he only concealed his mana once he saw the mana fluctuations of the first few beings at the Prisma stage fighting against each other. This was possible due to his mana eyes, and Jason was glad to see that he was able to pass everyone without any obstructions. Suddenly, without any warning, Jason's eyes began to burn, and it was as if his entire being had been struck by lightning. His body stiffened, and his wings stopped in their tracks when he sensed that something appeared behind him. It was an ominous feeling, but a heat Jason had never felt before seemed to envelop him. He inserted more mana into his eyes and turned around by instinct. However, there was nothing, no beast, no human or other being. Not even after he looked above him, where nothing should be. In the first place, Jason couldn't see anything. Only a moment later, the uncomfortable feeling and stiffness disappeared and he was able to continue flying to the closest capital without anything having changed. A few hours had passed since then, but Jason's mind was still unable to comprehend what had happened. His gut feeling told him that there was something wrong, but it was different compared to when he received the warning about the incident of the Yazlorn Caves and the Blood Eclipse. It was as if he was unable to determine whether his gut feeling was trying to warn him from something bad or give him a heads up for something good that was about to happen. This made Jason even more uncomfortable than he had already been before. Only when he reached the first capital Jason could take a deep breath, as he had rushed himself. Without further ado, he had reported what was going on, which made the city lord and management of the city panic. Jason calmed them down by releasing his Celestia aura, which worked better than he had expected, before asking them to send a notification to the other capitals. Normal quantum bracelets had lost their connection to the network that connected them with Skynet. Thus, Jason wanted to use the old means to convey messages. That was if it was still possible after more than 200 years have passed since they've been actively used. Jason wanted the capitals, which were in fact the fundamentals remnants of the old time before the mana breakout, to send each other messages through messenger crystals which they should have from each other for emergencies. Unfortunately, this was not possible because the capital didn't seem to have the messenger crystal of the other capitals. This caused Jason to curse out, thinking that it was the most stupid thing he had heard for a long time. As his mood plummeted, he had already turned around to leave for the other capitals which he would have to personally visit too. These fucking idiots don't even have the basic necessities to message each other during emergencies. How the hell did nothing happen until now? Chapter 485, Real Overlords by Hydesgrain. Over 24 hours had passed since Jason had arrived in the first capital, and he was overly exhausted as he had finally reached the last capital that was at the most rural. The capital he had visited prior was near the coast, while the first one he had visited was partially surrounded by a huge mountain. Yet, every single time Jason flew to a capital, his eyes were burning, while his gut feeling was chaotic, seemingly trying to tell him that something was going to happen. But nothing occurred all 3 times he felt something, and Jason began to wonder if his gut feeling was wrong. This would be the first time that would have happened, which caused him to believe that it was unlikely for his gut feeling to be mistaken about something. It was only when Jason left the rurally located capital that the mana stored in his mana eyes storage was rapidly consumed without him doing something. His golden silverish eyes began to glow brightly, enhancing his eyesight and perception of mana fluctuations drastically. Even if his eyesight had already been exceptional, allowing him to see something more than a kilometer away with great details, right now, his current state allowed him to see much farther than he ever did before. He was able to see the outlines of the low and mid-lick stage battlefield too. However, contrary to his expectations that the current state was stagnating as it did before, Jason's eyes widened in terror. A moment later, Artemis wings in the largest form of more than a dozen meters spread out from his back, consuming a large amount of nutrition as he soared into the sky with a breathtaking speed. Within the next few seconds, the unstable and chaotic mana that was caused by several million living beings passively replenishing their mana while releasing huge amounts of transmuted mana at the same moment came to a halt. The stored mana within Jason's eyes had been consumed, giving him the ability to see a tremendous amount of mana fluctuations gathering in 3 different places that were in fact the 3 battlefields of the Great Argos War's last battle. Under normal circumstances, the huge accumulated amount of dense and pure mana nearby the battlefields wouldn't worry Jason, but there was something worrisome about it. The entire stream of mana belonged to only 3 beings that didn't belong to either of the 2 fighting alliances. Furthermore, 2 out of 3 mana fluctuations his mana eyes perceived were unfamiliar, yet, Jason could tell who, or rather what the last, familiar mana fluctuations were. Right in front of him, on the low and mid-lig stage battlefield, the owlbear he had encountered during his primal bloodline awakening was wreaking havoc, destroying both fighting sites mercilessly. Jason could tell that it would only be a matter of time before the battlefield would turn into a puddle of blood, organs, and dead carcasses, which caused him to stiffen. His mana eyes also perceived that huge torrents of water-transmuted mana were released to the late and peak lig stage battlefield, while the same occurred on the Prisma stage battlefield, only that the mana there belonged to a searing hot fire affinity, burning the cloud above the battlefield. The beast at the peak lig stage battlefield, could it be the beast in the ocean? Did we enrage, or wake him up from hibernating? That can't be it, the owlbear was not hibernating anymore after all. He had no idea what was going on, but it was obvious that something huge was bound to happen. At that moment, Jason saw that the mana fluctuations from both beasts on the 2 battlefields that were further away had been compressed, which made it possible for Jason to see their outlines. A crow, and a whale. No, that's not a whale. What kind of beasts are they? He didn't know the other beasts' mana core ranks and how strong they truly were. But considering that the owlbear had already created 1 large, rotating crystal around 3 out of the 9 solidified prismarine crystals it had created, the other 2 beasts should be even stronger. The mana fluctuation and transmuted mana overflowing the area far in the distance was also an indicator for this assumption. Are those the strongest beasts of Argos? Argos' real overlords? This was not a certain fact, but it was not unlikely to be the case, and Jason couldn't help but gulp before he bit his lower lip nervously. Right now, what he witnessed meant that all 3 battlefields, both the Argos and Drake Alliance, would be annihilated, if nothing were to change. This was something that shouldn't happen, and Jason began to worry about the situation that unfolded far away from him. Yet, before he could see what was going on, his eyesight worsened as the entire mana inserted into his mana eyes had been consumed. Right now, Jason could not even see something properly because his eyesight was blurry, which was something that hadn't happened for a long time. Since when do I have to rely on mana to see something? He thought inwardly, yet, before he continued with his train of thoughts, his eyesight returned as his passive mana gathering had replenished a fraction of the used up mana. It was also at that moment that a searing hot heatwave reached Jason, while small streams of water began to cover the ground in front of him. The heat increased at a steady pace, while the small water streams began to turn into rivers. Suddenly, Jason saw humans being swept away by the floods of water, pushed under, which caused him to frown deeply. However, at the same time, a huge tempest manifested in front of him, at the exact location at which the low and mid-lig stage battlefield should be. At this moment, his worry about the possible outcome of the Great Argos had been washed away. Instead, Jason was not even sure whether a single being that had participated in the war would be able to survive this day, let alone months, or coming years. The current situation seemed to be extremely bad, yet, without any warnings, the flood of water, the heat wave, and the tempest vanished into thin air. Yet, instead of being able to relax, Jason tensed up as the owlbear seemed to turn in his direction. Only a moment later a spatial portal manifested next to him, out of which the large owlbear emerged. It looked exactly as it did before, with the physique of a bear and the appearance of an owl. There was only one thing that had changed, was the owlbear's aura. Jason didn't even have time to think about what he should do, and it was only his stigma and the Celestia aura he had instinctively released as the owlbear released a thin thread of mana that shot towards him. Instinctively, Jason accepted the thread of mana because he felt that the owlbear didn't release any killing intent anymore. It was still angry about something, but that was everything Jason could feel. After the mana thread had reached Jason, he sensed several emotions, pictures, and other means to describe something. This allowed Jason to understand the current situation better than before, even if it was extremely confusing. Just like that, the owlbear vanished and everything seemed to come to a standstill. Is that how the Great Argos War ends? Without a winning side, at a tie. He mumbled while looking at the chaos of the closest battlefield. Apparently, the three beasts that were in fact the owlbear, a crimson three-legged crow, and a Nui Mosasaurus gave the Argos and Drake Alliance a simple, yet impactful warning. Jason was unable to comprehend what had enraged the three overlords, but there seemed to be something important on Argos that had to be protected. Something that was worth intervening in a war of common and higher races that might return in the future, to take revenge. As such, the three overlords intervened in the Great Argos War, forcefully ending it as it disrupted their own interests. Their warning killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of living beings, but the final message was clear. Stop the war, or there will be no tomorrow for anyone. Chapter 486 True Nature by Hydesgrain. Demonstrating supremacy was an efficient and easy way to achieve certain goals, and the three overlords seemed to be aware of this fact. As such, they had revealed their strength before vanishing, leaving behind millions of beings that had been scared witless, unable to grasp how fortunate they had been to survive the simple warning. Jason couldn't believe what had happened either. What happened a few moments earlier was the most unlikely and dissatisfying way in which war could end. Not only was it a tie, but the reason the Great Argos War had been halted was still not solved either. Despite being weakened, Jason assumed that some of the sent troops of the foreign races were still present, and he assumed that the forcefully ended war would bring forth more problems than the three overlords had tried to end. Out of the information he had received from the owlbear, that hadn't killed him because it owed him a favor for helping it to break through, Jason was able to comprehend something important that caused him to have a set of complex emotions. If the overlords won't allow the Great Argos War to be continued, or they annihilate both sides, the future might not look as bleak as I assumed. I guess. The soldiers from the foreign races should be called back, now that it will be impossible to conquer Argos until the world bridges are more stable, allowing stronger beings to pass through them. That's great, but the big and ancient clans and sects from both sides will be left alone. Will this cause a small-scale war, or persecution? There were countless paths Argos' future could take now, but the Great Argos War had changed everything substantially. Not only did the mindset of most humans change drastically, but the big clans had also been split into groups that were likely to become each other's nemesis, causing many conflicts in the future. At the same time, it was questionable whether everything destroyed could be rebuilt just like that. Would the citizens start to retaliate against the way in which the big clans rule their kingdom and how they treat the islands they govern? There were too many questions, but Jason knew that some races would attempt to support certain humans' clans, even if it were to be in the shadows. Will we be able to regain peace again? Jason was not sure what the future would bring, but he knew that giving his best was the only way he could fulfill his master's wishes. As such, he dived towards the rivers of water that were left behind by the Mosasaurus overlord, where he tried to rescue as many people from drowning as possible. The water conjured by the Mosasaurus overlord seemed to be special. He might not be able to tell what exactly was special about the water, but it released faint mana currents that were intertwined with something he was not familiar with. It was not directly harmful, but it was difficult to circulate mana within the water. Nevertheless, Jason could take many beings outside the water without any issues. There was no need to distinguish between friends and foes because the Great Argos War was already over, but that didn't mean that Jason saved anyone from the Ephrata, Bahrain, or Myoldra race. They were exceptions and the root cause of all problems that didn't deserve his kindness. He had even saved the drowning members from the Drake family because Jason knew more than anyone else that most members of the Drake family and clan had been forced into a soul contract. As such, it was not their fault for standing on the Drake Alliance's side during the Great Argos War. In the end, Jason was still unable to believe how the Great Argos War ended after a duration of more than 2 years. It was a weird feeling, and he was unsure whether to be glad about it or not. However, it had already happened and only the final result counted. With that being said, Jason wanted to search for Fasro, Lusran and Merlarths to find more about the current situation. That was if after he couldn't find any more drowning people. Flying through the air, an astonishing, but even more disgusting sight about the most treacherous side that both humans and foreign races seemed to have in common, greed. While Jason flew past the area that had been the low and mid-lick stage battlefield, he witnessed humans and foreign races plundering the deceased spatial rings and everything valuable at a rapid pace. Despite being worn out by the 2 days-long battle, everyone seemed to have enough energy left to greedily skim through dead corpses, trying to collect as many goods as possible. This disgusted Jason because he could see hundreds of heavily injured humans and beings from foreign races, fighting against the Grim Reaper, whose scythe was already tightly put against their neck. Nobody paid attention, let alone help them, and Jason saw how they died while hoping that anyone would help them. The true colors of the present races were revealed, and despite not fighting against each other anymore, Jason could already see that conflicts had started to occur. Everyone wanted to reap the most benefits, and Jason couldn't help but be glad that the fear of the 3 overlords was greater than everyone's greed. Otherwise, more than half of the humans and other foreign races he saw would have started to fight already. Jason could only shake his head, thinking that the morals of the vast majority of humans and other foreign races had been flushed down the toilets. While flying towards the center of the 3 battlefields, where everything had started, Jason saw and rescued many injured and drowning beings. He did so instinctively and didn't care about the potions he handed out to everyone who required them. Jason didn't know how it could come to that, but he seemed to have lost faith in the foreign races and mankind being able to halt waging war. This was because he couldn't believe to what extent everyone's greed was, and it was only when he saw the first few individuals from foreign races and humans saving others that he could sigh in relief. At least it's not helpless, he said inwardly as he heard someone, on the ground, shouting something that caused Jason to divert his direction to the capital in the coastal area, only to blurt out a FCKU, Mosasaurus Overlord. Apparently, the flood manifested by the Mosasaurus Overlord had not only been a warning towards the 2 forces that were fighting against each other, but it had also flooded the coastal capital, sweeping away buildings and the innocent citizens within. The situation was grave, and even without having seen it yet, Jason could imagine how terrific it should be for the weak. Thus, he used his fastest speed to rush to help, hoping that he could help the weak as Shane and Dahlia had wished for. It was not only their wish that caused Jason to act, but he would have behaved like this without his masters that had hoped for him to protect the weak. He had always been like this. Despite not being a saint, he had been weak and powerless before. As such, Jason knew what he had needed the most at that time, someone strong who was selfless enough to help the weak. Even if it was not much for someone stronger to help others, the opposite side's entire life was on the line. Chapter 487 Baby Girl by Hydesgrain. When Jason arrived above the flooded capital, that was called Cadron, Artemis left his mana core to let Solaris occupy it. Artemis' wings disappeared before they were replaced by Solaris replica made out of black flames as Artemis manifested right next to him. At the same time, Jason reverted the changes of his facial features before he and Artemis dived towards the districts that were the most affected by the flood of water. Most of the water was already flowing back slowly, but it was way too slow for Jason to remain idle. Diving into the water, it began to evaporate due to Solaris' highly compressed flames that had a high temperature. Grasping the arm of the man whose weak mana fluctuations Jason had perceived through his mana eyes, he turned around and shot out of the water once again, bringing the man with him. He looked fine, and his biggest issue should be the water he had gulped down. With his mana eyes, Jason perceived that it was not a life-threatening amount of water and that the man had only been petrified because of his shock. Thus, everything was fine after he brought the man into one of the higher floors of the building complex that stood firmly on the ground. Artemis had followed him with two teenage girls she had tightly grasped in her talons. They were screaming in fright, but Jason thought that they couldn't be heavily injured if they had enough energy to scream so loudly. He simply sized them up with his mana eyes before he rushed out of the building once again. Time went by and it felt like an eternity as both Jason and Artemis had manifested several ice shells all over the flooded streets, allowing those that passed them to save themselves. Right now their focus was on the weakest of the weakest that were unable to save themselves. The old, ill, and youngest humans were those that couldn't save themselves, and both Jason and Artemis worked ceaselessly to save everyone with their utmost efforts. They didn't even notice that several hours had passed as Jason's mana eyes were subconsciously drawn to the largest building that had collapsed. Before, he couldn't perceive the mana fluctuations of anyone alive inside the building anymore, but just now his eyes were drawn to a specific place that radiated faint mana fluctuations. There was something weird about the mana fluctuations because they seemed to belong to two different individuals, yet, he could only see the outlines of one small child. Shaking his head, Jason thought that he was probably too tired. Nevertheless, he couldn't stop now, and instead of questioning his ability, Jason decided that it was most important to pay attention to saving everyone, which included the young child in the collapsed building. Flying through the destroyed window and hallways, he quickly appeared in front of a middle-aged couple that laid on top of the young child he had seen with his mana eyes. The ceiling fell on the couple as the building had collapsed, and iron bars had pierced through the middle-aged man's chest who had tried to protect both, his wife and child, only to lose both. At least that was what Jason would have thought if his mana eyes didn't tell him that the child was still alive. This was weird, but he carefully lifted the large pieces of rubble and other objects that fell on the couple. He perceived that the children's two mana fluctuations were slowly merging with each other, which was extremely weird, yet, Jason's hands never stopped to move, not a single moment. Only a short amount of time later, he saw the young child, who was at most 1 year old, for the first time. It was a girl with black hair whose fair skin was smudged by the dirt and rubble. Her clothes were drenched in blood, but she didn't seem to be in pain, let alone cry. This confused Jason as he had expected the complete opposite to happen. The little girl was just staring at Jason with her distinct purple eyes that had a glint of confusion, shock, and intelligence within them. From the time he had seen that she had two different mana fluctuations, Jason found the young baby girl to be extremely weird, and now that she stared at him without any signs of crying, he subconsciously blurted out, "Who the hell are you?" The mana fluctuations he perceived were still merging together, but Jason noticed that the small girl couldn't understand him, which was quite normal for a 1-year-old baby. Yet, contrary to the norms, she opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something before a small scream escaped her tiny mouth. After that, the baby's purple eyes widened in shock before her small head turned down, looking at her hands in astonishment. Jason frowned at that, but he had no time to waste any more. There were too many people that required help after all. Thus, he picked up the girl before he flew outside the collapsed building. "I can take care of the girl later, there is something weird about her. Furthermore, her eyes are also a trait." Every living being had absorbed mana fluctuations, even if one had never actively absorbed or sensed mana. Mana was subconsciously being absorbed into one's body after all. This subconscious absorption was not enough to strengthen one's mana core rank, but it was enough to adapt someone to mana in order to unleash one's mana perception. That was exactly why it took average talented humans 10 years before they were able to sense mana, while other races had it much easier. The mana on their planet was much denser and purer compared to that on Argos. Even on Argos, the difference of mana purity and density in some areas was vast, let alone Canir and the archipelago. On Canir, the average to start sensing mana was slightly below 10 years. Yet, the young girl that was barely 1 year old had already 2 mana fluctuations that were not identical. One could only have one type of mana fluctuations because they were one's means of identification, and everyone's mana fluctuations were one of a kind. Sometimes one's mana fluctuations were being altered through external factors or something that had changed within one's body, as it had been the case with Jason when he had unsealed his Celestia bloodline. Thus, having 2 types meant that one had 2 different identities, which was something that shouldn't exist. Jason's mind was rattling, and he didn't even notice that the baby girl was trying to grasp Jason tightly in order to attract his attention. The young girl herself was not aware of what was going on, yet she knew that it had died only a few moments earlier. At the same time, the girl knew that she had not died in a collapsed building in the middle of a natural catastrophe, but that she had been murdered by those who she had held dearly. After that, she had woken up with heavy weights pressing on her and a puddle of blood forming below her. She had been unable to move or do anything, as her body was much weaker than it had even been since she could remember. Everything was confusing until memories of a 1-year-old baby girl had resurfaced in her mind. Only a moment later, a young man with golden silverish eyes had lifted the weights and picked her up. Why is he so big? Or am I small? Are the memories I saw just now reality? After that, the young man had brought her outside the collapsed building, where a large white owl with black horns that had a stigma embedded onto one was waiting for them. The young man had placed her on the back of the owl that had screamed out in disagreement as Jason released his soothing aura towards her. At that moment, the baby girl's purple eyes widened in shock as she saw Jason's eyes and stigma that glowed faintly before the aura enveloped her. What kind of race is he? I can't sense anything yet. It's not enough that I've been killed by my loved ones, but why did I have to reincarnate in the body of a 1-year-old child too, as a race that has to hide from an invasion? Chapter 488, Reincarnation. Transmigration by Hydesgrain. Anna Unnel had been a renowned cultivator from the Yadras race that reigned several planets, while it had even been able to establish a small empire on the universe's planet. This was something she was proud of, and it had only been possible because of their ancestors' magnificent achievements. However, now that she had been killed, reincarnated in a child's body of a race that looked similar to the Yadras race, Anna's dream to become someone her race can be proud of had shattered. Anna was not even sure how she could reincarnate, and neither did she know what exactly the young man was saying to her. It was also a mystery to her, where they were, how much time had passed since she had been killed, or what exactly was going on. The only clues she had were some of her old memories, useless memories of a 1-year-old child, and the young man in front of her. Having a stigma indicated that he belonged to a different race than the relatives of the 1-year-old child. Yet, everything was much more complicated than she thought, and Anna did try to absorb mana, only to notice that she was not even able to sense it yet. The mana here should be extremely scarce. While Anna Unnel was occupied with sorting her thoughts, Jason could only see that the baby girl was instinctively stroking Artemis' feathers while they were flying around. It was not long before Jason had brought the baby girl to one of the camps that were constructed outside the city. He picked up the girl, and carefully handed her to the nurses and other staff that had already escaped the flood, helping out wherever they could. This made Jason happy, and his Celestia aura began to expand the happier he became. Maybe mankind is worth being saved. Is that what you two wanted me to see? Shane, Dalir. Jason smiled despite feeling melancholic, and it was only when he saw that the baby girl began to cry as she helplessly tried to reach him with her tiny arms that he was drawn out of his train of thoughts. He shook his head before he said, "I'll be back soon. Please take good care of that girl. She already lost her family, physical pain is what she needs the least. After that, he shot into the air again before he returned to Cadron's center, where most people required help. Many humans were helping out, and Jason could even see a few Arior helping out, which caused Jason's heart to make a leap. Even if nobody demanded their help, they simply did so. The Arior race had only been supporting the Shiabi clan because of the curse-cleansing beast, and Jason couldn't help but feel that their reasoning had changed a little bit after being with mankind during the entire Great Argos War. This was great, but rather than focusing on the Arior race's help to rescue Cadron's citizens, Jason thought about the baby girl and the weird way she had behaved. At the same time, the two different mana fluctuations that had already merged into one were suspicious too. It was as if she was not a 1-year-old baby, but how did that make any sense? Hours passed, and with the help of tens of thousands of helpers, the majority of citizens had been brought outside the dangerous areas or the capital if they were heavily injured and in dire need of help. During these hours, Jason had made up several possibilities about the baby girl's weird behavior, but one was absurder than another. In the end, there was no way that the majority of them were true either. From traveling back in time to being born with two souls imprisoned into one body, Jason thought of almost everything, and he couldn't get his hand on it. If she didn't have two mana fluctuations at that time, he wouldn't have bothered about her, but one of the mana fluctuations had traces of something mythical, and extremely old. As if it were the last remains of something mighty. Jason would have loved to ignore the baby girl and leave because he had more than enough things to pay attention to, but he was unable to do so. Even if one of his absurd theories were to be true, it was a fact that the baby had lost her parents and that she was alone in a world that was as dangerous as it had ever been. He assumed that Argos was more dangerous than for those below the Lick stage than it had ever been. Even more dangerous than it had been during the mana outbreak. There were many things Jason wanted to take care of, but the baby girl had jumped into his list of priorities without him realizing it. He was just too intrigued by what his mana eyes had perceived. Thus, after the rescue works were done, he returned to the camp where he had left the young baby girl. From far away, he could already hear a baby crying. Owing to his mana eyes, he appeared in front of the little girl within a matter of seconds. Meanwhile, Artemis, who was jealous, which she was clearly showing, had turned into her small form to squeeze on Jason's broad shoulder. However, when she and the baby girls locked eyes, Artemis could tell that something was off. She transmitted Jason her confusion and everything else she was perceiving. Unfortunately, he was as clueless about the girl as Artemis was. Thus he could only look at the small girl that had stopped crying. She lifted her tiny arms and pointed towards Jason, who stood behind the nurses that had given their utmost efforts to figure out the baby's issue. They turned around, only to see a young man with handsome, but also gorgeous facial features, beautiful eyes, and a toned body standing there. He smiled lightly before asking, "Can I?" The nurses were speechless by Jason's appearance and the charismatic and relaxing aura he subconsciously released. As such, they could barely nod their head without knowing what Jason wanted to do. Seeing that it was fine, Jason took a few steps forward before he stood right in front of the table on which the baby girl was lying. She was still pointing towards him, but her fingers had moved a little bit, while her tears had ceased. Jason noticed that she was staring at his eyes, or rather his right eye, only to realize a moment later that the baby girl pointed at his stigma. He lifted her up in a careful manner, and the nurses that had been starstruck regained their senses as they approached him and the baby. She cried for several hours and stopped right after the young man came back. The young nurse that had taken the baby from Jason a few hours early, thought in confusion. She felt that Jason had a calming aura, but it was still a wonder that the baby girl had suddenly stopped crying. Rather than that, the baby girl was suddenly laughing out as Jason had lifted her in his right arm. She was on the height of his neck and still pointing at something, and Jason, intrigued by her persistency, lowered his head, allowing the baby girl to touch his stigma. Suddenly, Jason's head began to ache as his stigma's glow intensified, enveloping the small girl's head. Only a moment later the glow dispersed, releasing the young baby that was astonished, but also overjoyed about the beauty it could see as Jason's headache was substituted by astonishment and shock. He tried to digest the sudden memories and pictures streaming into his head as Anna Unnell exclaimed inwardly. He really belongs to one of the more powerful races. However, before she could continue thinking about that, her mind was overwhelmed by the thoughts of the 1-year-old child that had fully merged with Anna. How is it possible that I'm too weak to take full control over the body of a formerly dead baby? Is that the disadvantage of my reincarnating? That I'm forced to merge with this useless child? Anna was annoyed, but how could she have known that her transmigration with all memories intact was nothing but a fluke? It was not a common reincarnation but the transmigration of a soul that had been shattered into millions of pieces at that. Only one minuscule part of Anna's soul had survived, and nobody was able to tell how it had reached Argos, let alone its way to the baby Jason saved. Suddenly, Jason, who was still trying to digest all information, mumbled something incomprehensible for the nurses, and it was only the small baby that screamed out in joy. Have you reincarnated? Or was it in transmigration? Chapter 489 Disgrace by Hydesgrain. Have you reincarnated? Or is it more like in transmigration? He had spoken in the universal language and Anna had been able to understand him without issues since the memories about her past life were still intact. Thus she had accidentally screamed out in joy, which was partially responsible for the old owner of the baby's body. She tried to nod her head, but it was extremely difficult to control her little body. However, when Jason saw her efforts, he couldn't help but sigh. Someone else's soul entered the body of a dead baby. Is that why there were 2 mana fluctuations my mana eyes had perceived? What kind of bullshit did I encounter this time? Jason was utterly confused, wondering how something like this was even possible. He was not even sure how the baby had died, in the first place because she seemed to be perfectly fine. The nurses were also of the opinion that she was unscathed, and it was only when Jason injected more mana into his mana eyes that he perceived something. There was a small scar on the baby's neck and faint, almost invisible remnants of the mysterious mana fluctuations he couldn't decipher earlier. Wait. Did the reincarnated soul heal the injury of the baby too? In that case, is it even dead, or did they merge together? His head was aching and he could only smile dryly at the small girl in front of him before he turned towards the nurses. If she has no relatives left, I will take care of the child for now. Orphanages should be overflowing right now. That is if they have enough funds to feed everyone. Jason was not sure what he was doing right now, but he could tell that it was important. The reincarnated being inside the small baby girl should have been extremely powerful in her previous life. As such, her knowledge should be wide too. Other than that, the baby has lost everyone around it, and without any help, Jason doubted that it would be easy for her to live on Argos as it was right now. Jason was not sure what exactly the other races were about to do, but he was able to see a few members of big clans they had fought against, helping others. They were also smiling and talking with other big clans they've fought earlier, which gave him the impression that the foreign races had stopped in their approach to suppress the big clans. Rather, it looked like most races that had been overwhelmed and annexed into the Drake Alliance's army had used the chance and fled. This included the Ephrata race, and Jason could only shake his head when he had heard about that. He wanted to take revenge and annihilate the entire army of the Ephrata race, but that had not been possible. Nevertheless, he was more than fine with how the current situation was because he could always take his revenge later. There were many things to take care of, but the biggest problems seemed to have vanished into thin air. While discussing with the nurses and the Cadran's authorities Jason had to search in order to be allowed to take care of the little baby girl, he was hearing lots of gossip from the surrounding. Most of the gossip were just rumors, but there were still true facts Jason heard. One of the rumors that was deemed a lie was in fact true. This rumor was about how Jason summoned the replicas of the gates of hell, and the silver, divine aura that was said to have emerged a moment later. When he heard this, Jason couldn't help but smile a little bit, only to hear other rumors that caused him to halt in his tracks. One of the enslaved members of the Drake clan has told me that the Myoldra race will continue backing them. They might have to leave, but they seem to want to continue with their soul contract and human trafficking. Other races will leave Canir, but from what another friend of mine told me, there are many other races that have sought refuge on the other continents on Argos since the Mana outbreak happened at that. Can you believe that? Will we have another war soon? It was not surprising that the Myoldra race didn't want to give up on Argos after they had almost achieved what they had planned. Furthermore, the resources they had used up in order to nurture the Drake family were vast, to put it simply. Jason assumed that the Myoldra race planned on turning the Drake clan into the most powerful entity before they would return once the world bridges allowed stronger beings to emerge on Argos. After that, they would enslave the Drake family, and reign over everyone on Argos. At least that was what Jason expected. This would probably take a few years, which was more than enough for Jason to change Argos in its essence. He was confident that he could achieve everything he wanted to as long as he was working hard enough. That was the least he was supposed to do in order to repay his master's kindness. The remaining information he had eavesdropped on was also interesting. To think that there are other races that have immigrated on Argos even before the Great Argos War. I doubt that they'll attack us, but it might be a little bit annoying for the future once their race's strength and population overwhelm the human races. However, that is not something we have to pay attention to now. Given the fact that world bridges prevented foreign races above the Prisma stage with 6 solidified prismarine crystals in their mana core to enter Argos, and that mankind had never heard about refugee-seeking races before, there shouldn't be a lot of them. As such, there shouldn't be much of a problem for now, and probably even the future. If Jason were to know the truth about everything concerning Argos, the other continents and just how oblivious he was to everything outside the human race's territory, the last thing he would be was calm. However, mankind had suffered a lot, and it wouldn't be a surprise to Jason if mankind's population had drastically decreased. It was unknown how many humans were left alive, but it was a fact that billions had died. If every island on the archipelago looked like Asterix, even if it was only a small degree, the number of casualties there must have reached a few billion, let alone Canir. It was frustrating but a simple fact one had to acknowledge as the bitter truth. The foreign races didn't even focus on destroying the surrounding cities because they wanted to preserve the resource, human. Nevertheless, attacking, driving away, or even annihilating big clans was already enough to cause a chain reaction. After the big clans' protection had disappeared, laws lost their value and outlaws had started to behave however they wanted to, as long as they had some sort of strength. At the same time, stronger beasts started to re-emerge, unrestrained from prior restrictions the big clans had forced upon them in exchange for not being killed. What happened afterward could be compared to carnage, and one had yet to figure out how many smaller cities with weaker defenses had fallen to beast hordes. This was shocking, and Jason could only shake his head with a glint of sadness in his eyes, only to feel that something was hitting him. It was Anna Unnel whom he was holding during the whole time. It looked like she wanted to say him something, but neither could she speak nor did Jason understand what she wanted from him. Thus, he ignored her for a moment until he received permission to take her with him until a relative would come and search for her. It was only then that he figured out the little girl's name that was Anna, which was quite a coincidence. However, instead of wasting more time, Jason decided that it was time to leave Cadron. There was nothing that held him here, and he had to meet Fasro and Lucen before doing anything else. Jason assumed that they would leave soon because another war was unlikely to break out if one were to disregard a possible civil war, which was something Jason expected to happen sooner or later. This was not something that should concern the other foreign races, and he should give his utmost efforts to become stronger as soon as possible, preventing the worst from happening. Taking care of the baby that had a reincarnated being inside shouldn't be much of a problem in Jason's opinion because she was listening pretty well. After he had told her to learn how to sense mana in her new body and wait until she was able to speak properly, Anna had turned quiet. Only when she felt hungry, tired or her diapers were filled did she voice out her discomfort. The latter seemed to be the most uncomfortable for Anna, and at the same time disgraceful because she cried the loudest there, and Jason couldn't help but smile dryly. It's good that the nurses gave me the necessities to take care of a baby, but somehow, I feel weird changing the diapers of a transmigrated person. These words caused Anna to cry even louder, embarrassed about being dependent on the young man in front of her. How disgraceful. Can't I just wipe out his memories? Chapter 490 It's Not Yours, Right? By Hydesgrain. Jason had never changed diapers, but it was less problematic than he thought, and he got the hang of it pretty quickly. Other than that, feeding her was pretty easy as she was already able to eat solid food. Thus, after she ate something and Jason had changed her diapers, Anna fell into a deep slumber despite her efforts to fight against the sudden drowsiness that overwhelmed her. Meanwhile, Jason flew back to the center of all three capitals where he assumed Fasro and Lucin would be. He was not sure about that, but it was highly likely that he would find them there. His mind was still trying to comprehend how transmigration was possible, but he simply had no idea what kind of existence was strong enough to accomplish something like this. The Celestia race should be strong enough to allow someone to transmigrate. I think. Maybe there are some techniques mighty beings have developed. Who knows? It's not like my current knowledge is helpful, in any way. While Artemis was as confused as Jason, Solaris didn't have any thoughts about the transmigrator who had entered the small girl's body. Other than that, there was still Petri, but he was still evolving. From the looks of it, Solaris had absorbed and transferred enough life force to him, allowing Petri to complete his evolution in the next few months. This was great and Jason couldn't help but anticipate how strong Petri would become. The petrification serpent was a physically attributed beast and didn't rely much on mana. Jason assumed that Petri's focus would remain on this aspect during his evolution too, so he was a little bit excited to see the final result. Additionally, some curses were likely to receive an amplification from the evolution as well, but, if Jason were to be honest, he had no idea what was going on. Mankind had yet to fully explore the different ways of evolving their soul bonds, and he doubted that many foreign races bothered paying attention to evolving beasts either. Given their circumstances, it would just be a nuisance, and based on what they'd heard from other foreign races as well as the information they'd gathered so far, only humans had a soul word. Anna Unnel, who had been disappointed about the place and body she had been transmigrated to, had changed her opinion drastically during the last few hours. Considering that she had seen beasts supporting humans in rescuing others, and was surprised that Jason could manifest the wings of the owl that had followed him, she could comprehend that her new life might not become as miserable as she had assumed. She was still trying to come to terms with the way she had died, but there were too many things she couldn't understand. Why did they betray me? Did I do something wrong? How did they even follow me into the secret realm I had entered? Did someone back them up? Were only those close to me involved or did other races have a hand in my death as well? Jason didn't know what Anna was dreaming about but she wriggled in his arms during her sleep and her little baby face looked nervous. Thus, he released his aura to envelop her while releasing a minuscule amount of mana which he spread through Anna's small body to release her tension. The amount of mana was not even enough to be labeled a drop in the ocean, but it was more than enough to pacify the restless baby, while his aura seemed to soothe and help her dream about something better. She finally stopped squirming and nuzzled her face against his chest, returning to blissful sleep. Only a few hours had passed since he left Cadron that he perceived familiar mana fluctuations. There were a few heads of big clans who he had encountered earlier, and they seemed to be talking about something. Jason hoped that the discussion would revolve around helping humans and not twist the situation and turn it into an opportunity to reign over mankind. Fortunately, the latter didn't seem to be the case, and they greeted him in an extremely polite manner when his feet touched the ground. This made him uncomfortable, but after he heard that they seemed to have spoken about him, Jason understood that they'd seen him summon the replicas of the gates of hell. He was not really worried about that because the human race was not aware of what they'd seen. Even Jason didn't know the entire truth, but what he knew was that the big clan's assumptions were pretty simple. They were under the impression that his rage had manifested an illusion of something grand in order to intimidate the other races. In the end, the gates of hell had only released their intimidating and ominous aura, and the real thread was yet to be unlocked. However, what made everyone praise and even revere him a little bit was the fact that he had been able to summon a terrifyingly strong and massive crescent blade beam. So far, no human had been capable of absorbing the required mana to manifest an attack like the crescent blade beam. This elevated Jason's status, because he was barely at the low lick stage yet, had achieved such a tremendous feat. Only when Heifer, who had also joined the Great Argos War after the Blood Eclipse, defended Jason, had the suspicion about him begun to die down. Heifer had told everyone that Jason had a soul weapon with a few particular one-time usage runes that allowed him to launch lethal attacks that destroyed the core of his weapon. Nobody remembered what his weapon looked like either way, thus he had no problem lying about Bayaka's core being broken, as it was not true. The heads of the big clans were astonished about the 1-year-old baby in his arms, and curiosity filled their minds with many questions. Was the baby his child? Or was there something else, something more mysterious about the baby? However, seeing that Jason was in a hurry to find the Arior and Elva race, they didn't bother him and instead answered the question about the two races' whereabouts. Only half an hour later, he found Fasro and Lucen, who were tending to the injuries of their comrades. They were inside the camp Jason had rested before, and only when they saw him did they tell the others to pay attention to their injured comrades. Similar to the big clan heads that had survived the Great Argos War, Fasro and Lucen were astonished about the baby girl in Jason's arms. Seeing their surprised faces, he could only smile, yet, he didn't immediately reveal what kind of special existence Anna was. Instead, Jason decided to figure out something else first. I'm glad to see that you guys are fine. My next questions might seem out of the blue, but how long are you planning to stay? Will you depart immediately or stay for a few months before the other races leave through the world bridges they'd emerged from? Jason seemed to be a little bit distressed, which was not unnatural given the current situation. Nothing was set in stone and chaos had descended on Argos, anything and everything could happen in the next few months, and that simple thought was scary enough. Even the Elva and Arior race felt that the next few years would be difficult for the human race, but their own race also had pressing matters to solve. As such, Lucen could only scratch the back of his head as he answered. To be honest with you, now that the Great Argos War has ended, we don't want to stay here anymore. You're alive, and from the looks of it, you won't turn into an infernal Celestia either. We will probably depart in 1, at most 2 months. Jason just nodded his head and looked at Fasro, whose thoughts were aligned with that of Lucen's. This meant that the humans were on their own to solve their issues. The big clan heads he had met earlier had told Jason that most of them had lost more than 60% of their members in the last battle. It was said that the area of the battlefield where everyone at the Prisma stage had been fighting had received the brunt of the attack, leading to heavy casualties and an alarmingly high death toll. Losing so many highly talented individuals was not really advantageous, and there were hundreds of thoughts swirling through Jason's mind. He was deep in thought when Lucen asked after hesitating for a moment. I don't want to be rude, but that little girl is not your daughter, right? I can't sense a Celestia aura from her. It's not that I want to interfere in your personal matters, but I was just curious. While Jason had expected him to be curious, he did not think that Lucen, who was from the Elva race that was supposed to have a great mana perception, would ask him such a question. No, she is obviously not my daughter, Jason laughed for a short moment before he continued. To be honest, I saved her in the capital that had been flooded. What made me curious about her was that she had 2 different mana fluctuations and understood the universal language. It looks like the soul of a mighty, deceased being has entered the body of an almost dead baby. At least, that's what I understand from the memories I've received. To put it simply, she is a reincarnate, or more like someone who had undergone transmigration if you want to put it like that.